Okay, here we go. Welcome to the Sustainable Water Network's Rivers series. I'm Kristen Wolf, the coordinator for the Sustainable Water Network, which is a coalition of various organizations and individuals that have been focusing on river issues, specifically river flows. And we've tried to change Arizona water laws to include watershed health, so that there is more water remaining in our rivers for the health of the rivers, as well as better recognition of groundwater pumping and its relation to river depletion. It also would have required studies for watershed health, but unfortunately it never made it out of the state legislature for the last 4 years. It's died in committee. And because water for nature, or water for rivers to exist in some minimal state of health, is missing from Arizona water law, we feel it's important to keep trying and get a bill like this passed. So we will always keep trying to find other ways to try and provide more protection for our rivers, including public education and outreach, such as this river series. So we are very happy tonight to have Ethan Seavey to talk about fires in the Bill Williams River National Wildlife Refuge. And Ethan is a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working at the Bill Williams Rivers National Wildlife Refuge. His work involves desert riparian restoration, which includes water monitoring and management, revegetation, endangered and threatened species monitoring, and working with prescription fires. Last year, wildlife was started by lightning in the Bill Williams River National Wildlife Refuge. And tonight, Ethan will talk about his work with wildfires in this sensitive and critical refuge. So welcome, Ethan, to our river series.
Thank you, Chris. Big shout out to Chris for gently nudging me over these past couple of months to make sure that I made this appointment today. So thank you all for joining me this evening. Like Chris said, for those of you who may not know me, my name is Ethan Seavey. The pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a refuge biologist here at Bill Williams River National Wildlife Refuge. For the next couple of hours, I'll be rounding out my 4 years at the refuge at the end of the day and moving on to a new position down in Tucson with our Ecological Services Office. But I am happy that this is my very, very last thing to do as the refuge biologist. Outreach is one of my very most favorite things to do. So I served as the resource advisor for the Planet Ranch fire, and today I'll be talking a little bit about the fire, but more broadly, we will be discussing fire as a management tool, the elements of wildfire, and the path to restoration following wildfire. On the screen, you're going to see the Chemehuevi and Quechan words for the Bill Williams River to the left. Out of respect, I will refrain from pronouncing these words because I haven't been taught the correct pronunciation. Next slide. All right. So I want to get everybody acquainted with the refuge. Each refuge has a very specific purpose and goals within the National Wildlife Refuge system. We were established in 1941 as a refuge for migratory birds and other wildlife, specifically species of concern. Our first biological priority, which is something that we recently updated during my tenure, is riparian restoration for the benefit of resident and migratory birds and other endangered species and species of conservation concern. And this means a lot of different things, and everything I cover today will play into how we meet this priority. A little bit more about the refuge. We are a designated globally important bird area because of our high species diversity. Over 350 species of birds have been detected on the refuge. We were designated by the Nature Conservancy and the Army Corps of Engineers as one of the first members of the Sustainable Rivers Project, which is a partnership between the Army Corps, which operates Alamo Dam, and I'll go into that a little bit more, and partners such as National Wildlife Refuges and other landholders in order to sustainably manage rivers. Prior to the Planet Ranch fire in June 2021, the refuge supported the largest naturally regenerating cottonwood willow bosque on the lower Colorado River. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. All right, next slide. So I want to introduce you all to our beautiful endangered species. We have our razorback sucker, bony-tailed chub, southwest willow flycatcher, western yellow-billed cuckoo, Yuma ridgeways rail, and northern Mexican garter snake. We are co-located with the partner, the Parker Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office branch in Parker, Arizona. And they handle most of the sampling, stocking, and management of the razorback suckers and bony. The Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office and the Refuge both participate in supporting the protection of the northern Mexican garter snake because it is semi-aquatic. So we cover the terrestrial side, the fisheries folks cover the aquatic side, but sometimes we have to meet in the middle and play nice. The Refuge focuses primarily on birds, and our surveys up until recently were contracted through the US Bureau of Reclamation. So it's really important that we understand what our federally listed species are because it helps us to understand what our obligations are, both to the species and to the American public. When we make a management decision on the refuge, we need to be considerate of the impact of threatened and endangered species. We are accountable to the Endangered Species Act. So we work closely with our Ecological Services Office when we consider these actions. And what that means is that for any large management action that we take that might harm endangered species, we have to conduct something called a Section 7 consultation. And I won't get into the details because it's a lot of boring policy stuff, but that basically means that we have to provide an analysis and justification that our management actions are not going to harm threatened and endangered species. And if they are, then we have to come up with mitigation measures in order to make sure that we're limiting the amount of harm that we're doing. So this is all very good background information to kind of set the stage to what we need to be considering when we start to do land management, especially when we're working on water management and river or riparian restoration. Next slide. So I love a little bit of audience participation. So if you feel comfortable, I'd like everyone to drop their answer to this question in the chat. So often we talk about fire as a negative process. What do you know or think are some benefits, ecological, cultural, societal, of fire on the landscape? I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to answer this question. I'll read through them as they come in because I'm really curious. And if there aren't any, no big deal. Allows new vegetation to grow. Exactly. You can also unmute if you want to and say a little something, whatever people are comfortable with. Historically important, yes, and we are going to get into that a little bit. Can have many benefits, but can be harmful in desert ecosystems. That is also really true, Joe. Open seed in some ecosystems. Yeah, like pine cones. Yep, provide seed germination. Yes. These are all really, really good. You guys know more than I do. Better than sweeping the forest. All right, great. Well, these are all really, really good examples of why fire can be really good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that we use wildfire, because I want to make sure that I'm highlighting that wildfire can be detrimental, but fire also can be something extremely beneficial. So next slide, please. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that using fire as a land stewardship tool is not a novel practice. Indigenous people all around the world have been using fire in many different ways to manage land and carry out land-based cultural practices for generations, and continue to do so to this day. And it is not really my place to summarize these lived experiences, but I would encourage everyone to check out these two resources that I have put out here, and I will drop in the chat. The first is an interview with Amy Christensen, who is a First Nations Indigenous fire ecologist and Canadian Forest Service employee. The interview covers a lot of ground, from emergency preparedness to differences between prescribed burning and cultural burning, to the loss and preservation of knowledge. And to the right, a short perspective piece written by Jessica Douglas, a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and cultural fire practitioner, on how land stewardship connects her to her land and her ancestors. So really quickly, I'm just going to drop this in the chat for folks if they would like to reference it. So bear with me here. Perhaps I will do that at the end because I'm fumbling around a little bit. All right, next slide, please. So prescribed fire, some folks really hit the nail on the head with this one in the chat. Up until 2020, prescribed fire had not been used by the Fish and Wildlife Service on the refuge. There were a lot of reasons why. A lot of folks believe that fire doesn't belong in desert ecosystems because it's not a natural part of the disturbance process, and that is true. But we can use prescribed fire in a couple of different ways in order to simulate some processes that no longer exist. So we have about 250 acres of marsh habitat on the refuge. We manage that primarily for Yuma ridgeways rail and other secretive marsh birds. We conduct marsh burns in order to eliminate decaded marsh vegetation to benefit the rail. And the rail is typically believed to be adapted for highly disturbed environments. I'll go into a little bit more into this later. The second way that we can use prescribed fire in a really beneficial way on the refuge is to eliminate fuels that have accumulated since the construction of Alamo Dam and the subsequent drought that occurred in 2016 to 2018. And Kristen brought up a really, really good point in the intro. One of the large reasons that we had a drought between 2016 and 2018 was that there was a lot of water usage upstream of the refuge that depleted groundwater levels and actually resulted in die-offs of large expanses of the forest. In addition, we are, as people know, we are in a drought here in the desert Southwest. And that means that, you know, we already have very little water to go off of as it is. And on top of that, the water control structure at Alamo Dam is in place in order to protect structures, human life and resources. And so the ability for them to release water to us is heavily dependent on human safety, as well as other management concerns such as recreation and whatever is happening above the dam from a hydrological sense. The second way that we, so we reduce fuel loading to prevent high burn severity. You know, are the fuels that I'm referring to is anything that has died or is dead on the refuge. And we also try to manage fire breaks on the refuge in order to ensure that we are able to ease our fire suppression efforts in the future. All right, next slide. All right, so how do burns benefit wildlife? So as I mentioned, the Yuma ridgeways rail is one of our focal species, and it is adapted to highly disturbed environments. With the floods that used to dominate the lower Colorado River every spring, the rails got very used to young cattail marsh. Now that we do not have those historic floods because of flood control structures and drought, we are seeing that cattail gets more and more dense every year without these big disturbance events basically blowing everything out and starting new. So when the cattail gets too thick, rails and their young face greater challenges moving through marshes for feed to feed and escape predators. But you know, very little is still known about these rails and their secretive nature. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit by way of natural history that we're still trying to learn. When I go out and do surveys for the rails, I'm not actually going out to see if I can find the rails. I go out with a boombox and a recording of a rail to see if I can get rails to respond to what they think is a neighbor. And so really all of the detection that I do is auditory. None of it is visual because they're so good at hiding. It can get very frustrating very quickly. So Courtney Conway and Eamon Harity at the University of Idaho are learning more about these birds, their long-term migration patterns and their short-term response to fire by deploying radio transmitters on the birds. You can see that on the right. They combine these data with vegetation data to develop habitat suitability models. And these programs basically depict the best habitat for these birds based on aerial imagery and other spatial data. This model is still a work in progress. The map you see on the left was taken in 2020, immediately after we burned Blackbird Island, the photo that you saw in the previous slide. And that is directly west of the Highway 95 bridge. The model shows that this habitat is not suitable for rails. However, in spring 2021, I detected 2 pairs of rails in that 20-acre burn unit, which we really had never detected before. But this is how science works. We are working really closely with Courtney Conway to improve the model so that it supports what we see on the ground. All right, next slide. So that's how prescribed fire works. Now I'm going to go into a little bit about wildland fire. When we talk about wildland fire, one of the really important elements that I think gets looked over a lot in media is the fire triangle. So in the fire triangle, as you can see on the slide, we have 3 different elements: heat, so basically precipitation or lack thereof, direct sunlight and its relationship to fuel's temperature, slope and aspect, and what that does to impact fuel's temperature. We have oxygen, so high winds not only increase the size of fire, but can facilitate its movement. And finally, we have fuel, so how much and what type. And that can be anything from, do we have a bunch of twigs or grasses that are going to burn really quickly, or do we have really big dead and down logs that have 36 inches diameter at breadth's height, which is a pretty big tree. So these things are going to burn and behave differently. And so we really need to be accounting for each of these 3 elements of the fire triangle in order to determine burn severity and how fires are going to behave. All right, next slide. So to give you a little bit of a teaser of some of the data that kind of impacted the Planet Ranch fire, you can see on the top, this was actually data taken from a weather station that was close to the Bill Williams River during the fire. You can see at the top this fluctuation in temperature day and night, but you can see that during the day, during the Planet Ranch fire, we were getting into the excess of 115 degrees some days. As someone who was working the fire, it was extremely unpleasant to work in. But this is something that really facilitated very active fire behavior. Below on the right, you can see that we were getting high winds during the day, which is when the fire was most active. And this was really facilitating movement of the fire and also really nullifying any suppression efforts that were done aerially. Okay, next slide. Okay, now finally, we go into the Planet Ranch fire. Started in June of 2021. It was ignited by lightning strike. There was a little bit of gossip around town that wasn't the case, but I assure you, I was one of the first people on scene that morning at around 5 in the morning. So yes, it was ignited by lightning strike after a thunderstorm the night before. It primarily burned our cottonwood willow bosque, and again, that was one of our largest remaining bosques on the lower Colorado River. It burned about 1,200 acres. Now, we work on a 6,000 acre refuge, so that's 20% of all refuge lands, regardless of habitat. And this all burned in 2.5 days. So I am a collateral duty firefighter, and I was serving as the resource advisor. What that basically means is that I was working with our incident commanders and our wildland firefighters in order to identify resources of concern. In this case, habitat that had been historically biodiverse for bird species. And I work with them to see if we can target suppression efforts to protect the resource. We had a lot of people show up to this fire. We had a crew from the Forest Service, the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, obviously, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs, in addition to several local and municipal fire departments. So this was truly, it truly took a village to get this fire under control. All right, next slide. Now, when we think about wildland fire, we think about firefighters, but you don't have to be on the fire line to assist in responding for fire. So for example, administrative support is really important during wildfire emergencies and responses. How are people going to be paying for supplies for firefighters? How are you going to be dealing with payroll? How are you going to be dealing with transportation and fuel? All of that goes through administrative support. So you have people who aren't on the fire line who are extremely integral to fire suppression efforts. One person who is extremely integral to fire suppression, who is actually working in Albuquerque, about 8.5 hours away was a spatial ecologist named Steve Sesney, who compiled this map on the screen to show burn severity on Refuge. And this was able to help us understand how the fire behaved on the ground. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I don't want to belabor what happened during the Planet Ranch fire, but I do want to talk a little bit about habitat restoration. And we can break that down into a couple of different types, both active and passive. So I'll go through both of those right now. Next slide, please. So very little active restoration has been done on the refuge, and we are still learning. You can see on the left here, we have an ACE crew, American Conservation Experience. This is a crew made up of folks who are 18 to 24 years old. They are taught a lot of different land management skills, including invasive species treatment, tree planting, chainsaw work, trail work, fence work. These folks get a lot of really great experience learning a lot of different things about land management and natural resource conservation. So we had this amazing ACE crew that showed up during one of our first plantings and actually helped us to plant a 5-acre mesquite bosque. Mesquite is kind of what we would call one of our powerhouse species because it's going to be more drought resilient than our cottonwoods and our willows because it can put down a taproot of about 145 feet. Now, this is really, really cool because as groundwater fluctuates over time due to drought, pumping, or water releases or lack of precipitation, the mesquite is going to be one of those plants that is going to be able to hold on longer without elevated groundwater tables. Whereas cottonwoods and willows definitely need more presence of surface water or shallow groundwater elevation. We have a couple of different funding sources that we are drawing from right now. We had oil spills as well in 2006 and 2010, which resulted in funding being awarded through the Natural Resource Damage Assessment and Restoration Program. And this is run through the Department of the Interior. We have received money through the Burn Area Emergency Response Program for the Planet Ranch fire, which we are actually implementing right now. We have on the docket to restore about 75 acres of riparian habitat in the next year. We are also receiving funding and support through the organization American Forests, as well as our friends of Bill Williams River and Havasu National Wildlife Refuges group. So like I said, we have a couple of different active restoration methods. One of them is planting. So again, we really are trying to focus on climate resilience. We are trying to focus on the idea that water is not guaranteed and water is going to be inconsistent and unpredictable. And one thing that we are trying to really focus on, or has been a big focus of mine, is being able to build traditional ecological knowledge into our restoration ethic. Folks have been stewarding the land for generations and have come up with some incredible ideas that really do work. And so it's really important for us to be considering the communities that we serve and hear from them when it comes to their feedback on how we do our restoration work. Again, we also are trying to do a little bit of restoration with cottonwood and willow pole planting. This has to be very strategic because again, we need to be very thoughtful about whether or not there's going to be reliable groundwater wherever we are planting. We are going to be, or we have been and are going to continue to harvest poles locally to support phenology. What I mean by that is the Bill Williams River is a very interesting river system. It has a very interesting flooding regime, and the cottonwoods and willows are very adapted to that very specific flooding regime. They actually leaf and seed out earlier than other trees on the lower Colorado River. So we like to harvest our poles, which basically we just hack off a branch of an old cottonwood, we put it in the ground, and it's a new cottonwood. And so that clone basically is going to maintain the same phenology or timing of seeding and leafing as the parent tree would. So we want to make sure that we're harvesting from a local stock so that we can continue to have a local phenology. All right, next slide, please. So the other side of this, and something that I know that you folks are all interested in, is the idea of natural regeneration. Natural regeneration is a desired condition. It is low cost, high reward, leads to, and it leads to resilient ecosystems adapted to on-the-ground conditions. So what do I mean by that? Well, pre-Alamo Dam, which is 36 miles upstream of us, the Williams River experienced up to 100 cubic feet per second floods every 5 to 10 years. For folks that might not be familiar with the unit of cubic feet per second, imagine a chicken as a cubic foot. That's approximately a cubic foot. And imagine 100,000 chickens running past you every second. And that's what these floods looked like, basically. So just kind of like a silly image to get that in your brain about how big these floods were. They scoured the landscape, cleared out dead and down trees, and pushed them into the lower Colorado River. And prior to the building of the dam, the vegetation was patchy and it wasn't as dense as it is now. So you didn't have this fuels buildup over time. So it created this mosaic and patchwork network of cottonwood and willow bosque and a braided river system with a lot of different channels. Very similar if you are familiar with the Rio Grande. And this was great habitat for southwestern willow flycatcher and western yellow-billed cuckoo. Now, through the Sustainable Rivers Program and our partnership with the Bill Williams River Corridor Steering Committee, we work with the Army Corps of Engineers and other partners on releasing water from Alamo Dam to support natural regeneration of refuge lands. We do a lot of work on monitoring groundwater levels over time, being able to bring that data back to the Corps, and trying our best to facilitate and negotiate with the Corps and other partners in order to release water to the refuge at optimal times to align with the seeding of some of our desired native species, such as cottonwood and willow. All right, next slide. So again, I'm putting an emphasis here on natural regeneration. Again, it is the most low-cost way that we can restore this habitat. So some of the other ways that we're looking at natural regeneration basically are actually nudging natural processes along. So we're being very discerning about where we are just seeding land and allowing seeds to germinate on their own, clearing ground so that seeds can land during a flood or flow release and germinate on their own. And so those are kind of our big ways of trying to figure out how do we let the river do what the river does best. So I want to read for you all a little excerpt I wrote last year. This was 4 months after the fire. I wrote this for our local newspaper. 4 months after the fire, refuge staff noticed many signs of natural revegetation. Gooding's willow and salt cedar are resprouting from the bases of charred snags. Young honey mesquite trees are popping up throughout the burned area, most likely planted by coyotes and javelina who consume the seed pods. With such substantial tree dieback, more space is available for cattail, bulrush, and common reed to grow, creating a mosaic of marsh habitat in areas that were previously overrun by salt cedar. Sacred datura, accolade heliotrope, yerba mansa, and other flowering plants create natural pollinator gardens for swirling masses of bees and butterflies. While refuge staff plan on actively restoring parts of the burned area using methods such as tree planting and invasive species control, it is clear that the Bill Williams River is already hard at work with its own habitat restoration. So just a little bit of hope when it comes to seeing this river system through to success and seeing it through this, this pretty catastrophic fire. All right, next slide, please. So it really does take a village. We need your support. We need the support of the community. We need support of students. We need support of our friends group. And you can see on the top right, we have a group of high school students who actually built elf owl nest boxes for us. We installed those around the refuge right before elf owl nesting season so that the owls had cavities to return to when they came back. A lot of our saguaros and other nest trees were burned up in the fire. And so we're very, very excited that these 10 boxes are out on the refuge, hopefully serving the purpose that they're supposed to serve as cavity nesting trees. In the lower left, you can see two of our fabulous, fabulous friends, volunteers who are have many, many bags of Sahara mustard, which is a non-native species in hand. We did we did a very grueling hand pulling of large Sahara mustard individuals a couple of years ago. And, you know, invasive species treatment is the least sexy part of habitat restoration, but it is one of the most important. So these folks were absolute troopers. I would encourage folks to check in with the refuge as much as they can to bring good ideas to the table. And we are going to need a lot of help for our communities. And again, if folks are in the area and able and willing to assist with invasive species planting, maintenance, and monitoring, we would love to have you. All right, next slide, please. All right, I didn't cover all the work that we accomplished over the past 4 years in my time here at the Bill Williams, but this is the greatest of the greatest hits. I welcome your thoughts and feedback. We are striving to always be better, especially when it comes to our relationships with the communities that we serve. So now I want to open it up to questions.
Ethan, can I ask about the salt cedar?
Yes, absolutely.
So it is an invasive, and it's somewhat, are you saying somewhat naturally there, or would you rather just not have it and let it be willows and mesquites, for example? I mean.
Yes, that is an extremely, salt cedar is extremely controversial. And, you know, most invasive species are. What I would say is that we're never going to fully eradicate salt cedar from the refuge. When we think about invasive species management is one of the most crucial things that we can do to restore habitat. It's also one of the most expensive things we can do. And so we really have to consider not only what is happening on the refuge, but off the refuge. So when we're looking at invasive species treatment, we really need to take a landscape scale approach. So we have salt cedar upstream, we have salt cedar downstream. We're not going to eradicate it. What we can do is try to treat it strategically in certain areas where we would like to do targeted restoration. And that is a way for us to actually gain some success. Because at some point that native vegetation is going to be able to outcompete salt cedar, and we aren't going to have to treat in those targeted areas anymore. You know, we have a very small staff. I am the biology program. So with such a small staff, we really have to be thoughtful about how we're managing. And so we might not like salt cedar. It is extremely responsive to fire, but we have to work within the bounds of what is possible for us.
You said responsive to fire, so it does not really get burned. Is that, what do you mean?
Oh, it burns really hot. It is a high.
But then it comes back then?
Yes, that's correct. So not only is it extremely flammable because it's a very oily wood, which increases the fire risk for native vegetation that might be around it, but also it will just resprout right from the base. So right now we're positioned really well where we can see the individuals that are resprouting and we can treat them strategically.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Should I be looking in the chat here? I'm seeing some.
Yeah, can you see the chat?
Yes.
There's a question from Carrie and Nancy about bufflegrass.
Yeah, luckily we do not have bufflegrass yet, but that is a really, really good question. So when we're looking at invasive species management, we are doing this thing, and if you're in Tucson, you probably know about this, is early detection rapid response, or EDRR. So we want to be seeing what's on the horizon for us by way of what invasive species are creeping toward us, and that will allow us to get eyes on the ground to make sure that if we find bufflegrass on the refuge, we treat it very quickly. So we are being very vigilant. And we are conducting baseline inventories every year of certain sections of the refuge in order to stay on top of it, just so that we don't have the issues with bufflegrass that you get in southeastern Arizona.
Did the runoff from the fire affect the water quality in the Bill Williams?
Yes, very good question, Thomas. So we actually had the Central Arizona Project, which has an intake channel right next to the refuge. For those of you who don't know, the Central Arizona Project, it basically pulls water from the Colorado River and brings it to Phoenix and Tucson. And at our last steering committee meeting, the folks at the Central Arizona Project asked if we had done a dam release, but we had just had a lot of monsoons because it had pushed a lot of ash and sediment into the water and created really murky water that, you know, what might have caused them to shut down pumps. So we have to be really thoughtful about that. But yes, we are seeing a lot of sediment runoff, and we're seeing a much more dynamic system since we've had crazy monsoons this year. Really good question.
And did that affect the aquatics?
You know, we aren't able to, we don't have the staffing or capacity to measure aquatics at the moment. I imagine that a lot of those species are actually pretty adapted to high turbidity. But we don't really have data to support that.
Do you want some yerba mansa?
Does anyone want some yerba mansa? We have quite a bit of seed here at the refuge, and we're actually growing it out through a contractor with the National Park Service. So we are all set, but if anyone else wants some, Carrie and Nancy can hook you up. All right, water level. Kay says, water level changes have you noticed over the past few years, concerns for the future? So yes, 4 years of data does not a trend make. So I can't say definitively that I've seen trends in the data that are going to go in either direction. We do see extremely fluctuating and really, really deeply complicated hydrological issues happening on the refuge. Part of the Bill Williams River is ephemeral. That is pretty natural. It does go dry every summer and then comes back every winter. So we are seeing fluctuating groundwater levels over time. And just annually, we're seeing very, very dynamic groundwater. That is, I've deployed groundwater transducers, which basically measure groundwater in real time to several of our groundwater monitoring wells. And you really can just see that annually we fluctuate a lot. And then the biggest concern for us is surface water. I mean, it's also groundwater, but surface water for us, the presence of surface water, it helps to facilitate marsh habitat expansion and growth. And then it also provides forage and feeding grounds for species that are insect eaters, like the southwestern willow flycatcher and western yellow-billed cuckoo. So, trends over time are looking more and more unpredictable, I would say, if unpredictability can be a trend. So it's definitely something that we're concerned about and monitoring.
So I have a question.
Go ahead.
Ethan.
Yes.
So the Bureau of Land Management declared that the lower Bill Williams River was eligible for wild and scenic river status. In your view, how would that help the river management? Is that a desirable thing to pursue?
So I'm gonna throw a mea culpa here. I don't have a lot of background on the wild and scenic river program. I would say that any kind of visibility that we can get at the refuge by way of its innate value to the public and to the wildlife could be very, very beneficial. Gary, you had also asked about how we treat salt cedar.
Right.
So we do that in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that we try to do that to it so that we're limiting the amount of impact that chemical would put on the land is that we do a cut stump method, where some spry 18-year-old takes a chainsaw and cuts off the salt cedar at the base and then uses a paintbrush with some dyed herbicide on it and paints it onto the stump. And that is basically going to percolate down into the root system and kill the tree from the top down, so that you're not going to have sprouting from the base. So that's how we try to do it. And that's the most effective. it can be pretty labor intensive. So sometimes we do something called a basal bark spray, where we don't spray any of the foliage. We just spray again right at the bottom of the tree. And that pesticide will again percolate through the bark and then seep down into the roots. But I have to say, you have to do it hit it with a couple of different treatments before the salt cedar is going to die.
Question from Tim Flood.
Let's see. Oh, Tim, very good question. Oh my gosh, this blew my mind. I did a transducer upload shortly after the fire in an area for a well that was in the area that burned. And for some reason, this well was salvaged. I was very excited. I was losing sleep over the idea of losing this data. But what I did notice is that the depth to groundwater decreased right where the fire started. So yes, we had an increase in groundwater elevation right after the fire. And that actually, again, facilitated the resurgence of some marsh habitat that had been kind of waning a little bit and is now really, really thriving because of that lack of evapotranspiration. Really good question, Tim. 9 new messages. Let's see. Have tamarisk beetles had any effect on salt cedar? Really good question from Carrie and Nancy. So yes, the salt cedar beetles arrived on the refuge in about 2017. And the interesting thing is that coincided with the drought that we experienced on the refuge due to water usage above upstream. And so the beetles weakened the salt cedar, and then the drought just killed it. So I think that it was truly a meeting of the minds when it came to killing off the salt cedar. The issue there being that the beetle can be beneficial for killing salt cedar, or at least for stunting it and making it less viable. So basically less likely to reproduce. The issue being that when you have a dead salt cedar that just is amongst a thicket of dead salt cedar, it's covering too much ground to allow for natural, to allow for native vegetation basically to come back. So that's when we use our tools like wildland or like prescribed fire through pile burning or broadcast burning to clear out any kind of decadent, dead tamarisk salt cedar that we might have that might be taking up space that we could be planting native species in. How have your counts of cuckoos been this year in the Cottonwood Burn area? To my knowledge, again, we run those surveys through contractors. To my knowledge, we have not detected any cuckoos in the burn area, which is to be expected. They really prefer early to mid-successional vegetation that is really dense, and we're just not there yet by way of regeneration and also restoration.
All right, I don't see any more questions in chat. And I just had a question for you, Ethan. I know you've been there for 4 years, and you spoke about the wildfire from last year. I'm just wondering, in your work there and speaking with others, is there like a trend in terms of fires in that particular area?
So there have been a couple of spot fires on the Bill Williams. They've been started in different ways. One fire happened shortly after an oil spill. So the Highway 95 bridge crosses right over the delta of the Bill Williams. An oil tanker fell over and into the river and spilled a lot of oil, and then that oil caught on fire. It burned about 300 acres, but that was again in, I believe, 2006 or 2010. So fires are just because humans are on the land, because of the changing climate, because of the introduction of things like salt cedar, which are extremely flammable and really enjoy catching on fire. I see this being a trend moving forward. It's something that we've experienced in the past. It's just, we've never seen something this big on the refuge, at least in recent knowledge and history, but I don't anticipate it will be the last time. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, that seems to be the trend out west and, so many places now. Yeah.
And that's why I think it's extremely beneficial for us to study this, because if fire is going to now become another part of these zero riparian or desert riparian systems, then it's really important for us to be asking these questions of, well, the why and the how, and how do we restore it? Because I think we're getting to a point where we're not going to be able to stop the wildfires, but we need to figure out ways to restore in such a way where we're mitigating fire later on. So again, planting trees like honey mesquite, which are really fire adaptive and you can't kill with fire, they'll just keep regrowing, could be a really good way for us to restore some parts of the refuge or just parts of riparian habitats in general.
I see one more comment here. I have to agree with Tricia. Your chicken equaling 1 cubic foot. That's a good visual for trying to visualize how much water is going by at any particular time.
Yeah, so I'm a whitewater canoeer, and so that's the way that we talk about whitewater as well. So it's a good, especially with the younger paddlers. So that's definitely how we do that. Yeah, and I love that comparison. Tim says, do you see any net positive effect about fire in the riparian area? So I do see this as an opportunity. I think that it was extremely sad when this happened, but quite honestly, the riparian habitat in this particular area that was impacted by wildfire was actually really degraded. A big part of the reason for that was the drought, which not only killed the tamarisk, the salt cedar, but also our native vegetation like cottonwood and willow. So yeah, it was our most intact stand, but a lot of that biomass was actually dead. And so it wasn't a question of if there was going to be a fire, it was really when. And after the shock wore off, about 1,200 acres of my refuge being burned, I started to look at it as an opportunity. We can really create a resilient system this time around, or we can help the river to create a resilient system. We can try to incorporate elements of fire management into how we restore so that, we're ready for the next fire. So I see it as a positive. I see it as a net positive, even though it was extremely hard and it's going to take a lot of time, money, and personnel hours to restore. Oh, Carrie and Nancy, when will my position be filled at Bill Williams? It will be filled. The government moves slowly, so it's probably going to be about a year, but I'm very, very lucky. The staff at Bill Williams is really stepping up and is going to be filling in a lot of my duties until we get that next biologist up to speed. So I am going to be keeping a finger on the pulse, and hopefully I'm going to be able to travel up from Tucson to, support the next biologist. Suzanne, oh, very, very interesting. Has anyone ever considered a U.S.-Mexican collaboration to bring water from the Gulf of Mexico to Pima and Yuma counties in Arizona? Not that I know of. I do know that there have been efforts to connect the river back to the Gulf of Mexico, because right now the Colorado River kind of stops in Yuma and it doesn't get all the way to the ocean, which is extremely sad. Yuma, Arizona used to be a port city, which is pretty wild. Yes, the Gulf of California, very good. Yes. I don't think that there's any talk about bringing water from Mexico up to the US. I'm sure that there are a lot of treaties and a lot of things that people are talking about that I have very little knowledge of and or don't get paid enough to know. So
Well, this has been an excellent presentation, and I thank you for all that important information, because I think we do need to learn more about fires, in terms of prevention and also natural, restoration. So it was a great presentation, and I thank you for being part of our river series.
Mhm.
And-
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. And thank you all for doing this really important work. I dropped my email in the chat if folks were shy and wanted to reach out to me via email if they had any questions.
That's great. Thank you again. And just to conclude, our next month's speaker is going to be Sandy Barr, the chapter director of the Grand Canyon chapter of the Sierra Club. And she's going to be speaking about water and the Arizona legislature, how they have failed to address the water crisis. Basically discussing what was proposed, what was blocked, what would have made a difference, and what to do in the 2023 session. So hopefully you can all tune into that. The date is to be determined. So again, I thank you, Ethan, for all the work that you've been doing at the Wildlife Refuge, and wish you all the best in your new position in Tucson.
Thank you, folks. Yes.
Thanks,
Have a very,
Ethan.
very good evening.
Right.
Great
too.
job. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you,
everybody.
Bye.
All right.
And thanks, Kristen, for inviting me on. I really appreciate it.
It's good to have you.